I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the ripple effects of Russia's invasion in Ukraine include major disruptions to the United Nations food program. He says the impact of that invasion goes far beyond soaring energy prices, and the world must respond. Ukraine is one of the world's major wheat exporters, and since Russia's attack, global wheat prices have risen to levels not seen since 2008. Global Affairs Canada Assistant Deputy Minister Sandra McArdle says Canada is already making contingency plans to support countries that rely heavily on wheat exports from Ukraine. With us to discuss food insecurity in Canada and around the world is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you.
So let's start with how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting food security around the world.
Well, in the agri-food sector, everything is interconnected. What happens if something happens in the Ukraine, it will eventually catch up to us. When you look at prices, availability, and obviously the conflict in that region is clearly impacting access and the ability of that region to export as well. And that region is responsible for over 25% of world exports for wheat and corn specifically. And so those are key ingredients for the entire agri-food sector around the globe. The other issue, of course, are fertilizers. Without proper fertilizers, without access to fertilizers, you can't grow more, which is why global food security is a little unnerving right now.
And at the same time, we hear the Prime Minister saying this invasion will disrupt the UN World Food Program. So what is the significance of this, and how does this connect to Canada?
Well, absolutely. So growing anything will be difficult this year. So the UN program will be impacted, no doubt. So this is not a good thing. It's not happening at the right. Well, it's a war conflict. Obviously, it's war, but it couldn't have happened at a worse time, given the fact that supply chains were experiencing some major challenges over the last 6 months, and now with this war happening in the Ukraine. Again, we will see food prices around the world increase, including in Canada, US, and elsewhere.
And we know Canada is known for its wheat exports as well. So what is the scale of Canada's involvement in global wheat exports?
So actually, we export slightly more than the Ukraine, but not much, which is why, I mean, if something were to happen in Canada, we may actually see the same kind of impact around the world. But Canada is not as complicated as Europe, as you know. And so that's why a lot of investments are coming our way. However, to balance things out, you really need Europe's bread basket to function quite well. And Ukraine right now, along with Belarus and Russia, aren't necessarily well. We're not looking at a very, very productive harvest for this year as a result of the conflict. So, which will actually disrupt markets for a very long time.
And you mentioned earlier the cost of fertilizer is rising, so is the cost of fuel. So how would this affect farmers and consumers within Canada?
So farmers obviously are very concerned about fertilizers. They've been concerned about fertilizers for months now because of supply chain problems. But now with this conflict, we are expecting fertilizer prices to move even more. We're hoping that Canadian companies like Nutrien and Mosaic will see their roles a little bit differently this year, instead of trying to capitalize on strong demand for fertilizers. So it's a hope and see sort of scenario. As for consumers, oil is the big story right now. We are expecting oil prices to impact food prices early on due to higher transportation costs.
All right, Dr. Charlebois, just about a minute left here, but what are some other items that Canadian consumers should expect to see the biggest jumps in?
So over the short term, oil is the big story with transportation costs. Midterm, 3 to 6 months, if the conflict continues, we are expecting grain-based food products to be impacted. Bakery, center of the store sort of products will be impacted. And over the long term, we are expecting yet again animal proteins to be impacted. So looking at the meat trifecta, pork, chicken, and beef, we're expecting higher prices at the meat counter. And finally, over a year, dairy and eggs could be impacted.
All right, Dr. Charlebois, thank you again for your time today.
My pleasure.
We discussed the current situation in Ukraine with defense expert and professor Dr. Christian Leuprecht. Well, it looks like Russia has announced yet another limited ceasefire and a handful of humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to flee Ukraine. But there is little to indicate that is actually happening. The two sides met for talks again today. This while the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers are scheduled to meet in Turkey on Thursday. Ukraine's president is calling for a global boycott of all Russian products, including oil. This comes as Russian forces increase their shelling of encircled cities. Meanwhile, Russia's president has likened Western sanctions on his country to declaring a war. Well, with us now to discuss the conflict is Dr. Christian Leuprecht, security and defense expert and professor at Queen's University and the Royal Military College. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
My pleasure. Hello.
So what are the latest updates on the military situation within Ukraine, sir?
Well, what we see here is not much movement in the last 24 hours, but it appears that the Russians are massing troops for an assault on Kharkiv, as well as assaults from westwards and eastwards around Kyiv in an a renewed attempt to encircle the city. It also appears that the Ukrainian forces in the south of the country have been able to thwart, or at least for now stall, further progression of an offensive towards Odessa. But certainly there's expectation that Russian troops will continue to push in that direction and expected a bombardment of that city in the coming days.
And as this invasion continues, we're hearing talks about Russia taking all of Ukraine. So what do you see as the current Russian strategy here?
Well, I think everybody's a little bit puzzled as to what the end game really is from the Kremlin here. I mean, with the troops they have, they've had significant difficulty achieving even their most minimalist objectives. I mean, if their most fundamental tactical objective was regime change in Kiev and taking Kiev within the first couple of days, like clearly they haven't achieved that yet. And we'll see the Ukrainian defenders may well yet hold out and be able to hold Kiev. So in that sense, I think it's not really clear to me how the Russians will attempt to take the whole of the country and to what extent this is just a narrative to reinforce Putin's claims over the whole of Ukraine, and to what extent this is simply bluster in order to detract from the extreme severe misplanning and missteps that we've seen by the Russian military over recent days.
And at the same time, we're seeing NATO handle this very delicately in that it doesn't want to be directly involved in the conflict. Last week, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg ruled out no-fly zones over the Ukrainian airspace. Tell us a little bit more about this move and what it means.
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of reasons for that. The obvious reason is any contact between NATO troops and Russian troops could seriously escalate the situation. I think there's also concern that getting involved might hand a propaganda victory to Putin, because of course his narrative has always been that this is an offensive war, whatever, by NATO against Russia, and so any confrontation there would really play into Putin's hands. But I think there's also very real tactical concerns. The West has provided significant amounts of anti-aircraft capability now to Ukrainian troops on the ground, many of whom aren't all that well trained on that capability. And so they'll assume that anything that flies in that airspace is pretty much Russian assets. So there's a real risk of friendly fire as well. So I think many good reasons why NATO is reticent, but at the same time, it's not clear that the significant risk involved in trying to establish a no-fly zone is worth the, I think, relatively moderate tactical payoff, given that most of the humanitarian casualty are coming from artillery and tank fire, not from Russian air assets.
And as this war continues, we're also seeing a war against disinformation happening, especially within Russia. Tell us a little bit about how Russia's military is really impacting media within the country.
Yeah, so I think Putin has realized he's lost the control of the narrative outside of Russia. So he's really doubling down on the narrative within Russia. And he does this in a couple of ways. So one is to try to stifle dissent, protest, freedom of the press, and also now, for instance, the ability to confiscate assets by people who he deems disloyal to the regime. So this suggests civil servants or oligarchs who speak out against him. So really trying to control that narrative. At the same time, of course, he's imposing, I think he's readying the Russian population for martial law with these extreme information constraints, and probably going to introduce conscription in the very near future.
A lot to keep our eyes out for. Dr. Luprecht, thank you again for your time today. There is growing concern that Russia may be using cryptocurrency to avoid the impact of financial sanctions imposed by Western allies in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions have sent Russia's ruble to historic lows and have closed the country's stock market. As the war continues in Ukraine, there are many questions that arise in terms of the long-term impacts this may have on the global markets and economy. And to help us with these questions, we're joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
Now, it's really interesting how this war has highlighted just how interconnected the global economy is. We're seeing commodities from oil to wheat being impacted. So let's get into this, Brendan. I want to start within Russia. So we've been seeing Russians line up at ATMs to get their money out of the banks. What about cryptocurrencies? Do they have access to crypto right now?
Well, I believe that they do. I mean, I haven't tried to access cryptocurrency in Russia myself, but I understand they have limited access to crypto. But crypto is not a market that is so well developed that you can, or is it so fungible that today you can either buy bread or a mega yacht with your crypto? It is a means of value that's still in its transfer of wealth that's still in its infancy. So access to crypto is maybe a little bit helpful, but if you're accessing it using rubles that have fallen, as you said, to a fraction of their current value, I don't know how really helpful it's going to be in dealing globally, as Russia's going to need to at some point.
And I think that's why the U.S. is working on regulating cryptocurrencies, especially amid concerns that Russia is using crypto to avoid the impacts of Western sanctions. So taking all of this into consideration, Brendan, how do you see cryptocurrencies evolving from all of this?
Well, the first words that came into my mind when you talked about the U.S. government trying to regulate everything was, good luck with that, as the kids would say. So my father's often said, incidents are used to do things you want to do anyway. Governments inherently don't like crypto because it is a repudiation of the truly atrocious job that most governments have done, even in the West, of maintaining their own currency as a store of value. By printing money for really the last 15 years in an uncontrolled manner, we've somehow managed to have little to no inflation, and yet, at least in terms of goods and services, but now we're seeing a massive increase in inflation, which, as much as we're told it's temporary, we haven't seen this sort of inflation ramp up since the 60s. I mean, really, not in my entire lifetime have we seen inflation come back like that. So governments don't like crypto because there is a fixed amount of it. It's created at a fixed controlled rate. It allows for a transaction of value outside of the government realm. So I can understand why they want to regulate it, but they're like a big giant lumbering behind something that's moving a lot faster than they are.
And we know inflation is also connected to commodities like oil and natural gas and wheat. So considering that Russia is the third largest oil producer in the world, Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe in terms of wheat. How do you see these commodities kind of evolving from this war as well?
Well, obviously, the price of everything has gone up, but the price of commodities, you say, especially. Now, if you have like a Western middle upper class level of job, you don't think that much about the price of bread, which is why the big grocery store chains in Canada managed to come to some arrangement around the price of bread that saw it at higher levels than it really ought to have been, and nobody noticed for a long period of time. But in most of the rest of the world, the price of bread is the question of life and death. So when you see these prices going up, it's not an intellectual nicety, an economic experiment. It is can be a life and death situation. So if we see these commodity prices globally much, much higher, you will see, I think, a greater degree of civil unrest. We've even seen it in Canada such that it made the news. Now, it wasn't about inflation, but it was a repudiation of governments trying to control things. You're going to see that, I think, in a lot of the rest of the world. People noticed when Canada started to have civil unrest. I think you'll see it elsewhere, should we see these commodity prices continue to be so high.
All right, Brendan, just about a quick 30 seconds left here, but what about Russian oil? How do you see that, this situation in terms of the oil industry in the long term due to this war?
Well, it'd be really great if Canada had an oil pipeline to blue water that works. I mean, Keystone's looking very smart right now. I mean, I have totally boggled why we send so much money to countries that really hate us in the Western world when Canada has as clean an oil as is going to be produced. You can call it the tar sands if you will, but the environmental regulations in Canada are much better than they are in most of the other countries we import oil from. So Canadian oil, eh? That's all I got to say.
Some food for thought there, Brendan. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Nima.
We'll be right back. Gas prices continue to rise across the country as officials respond to concerns among Canadian consumers. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston is expressing concerns about large gas price increases in his province, which are up about 30 cents in the last week. He says the province is looking at removing taxes placed on gasoline, which would be similar to a move announced on Monday by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. He said he is suspending a 13-cent per litre provincial gas tax as of April 1st. Gas price hikes can also be seen in other provinces, and in some cases, prices are hitting record levels. This comes as analysts warn that further increases lie ahead, which is prompting questions about whether other provinces should consider removing their gas taxes. But one expert says that is easier said than done. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper insight into this is Mr. Constantine Pesaris, Professor of Economics at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. Professor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hello, Mina. How are you?
I'm doing great, sir. Now, let's start with a brief overview of what gas taxes look like across the country.
Well, they're pretty high, and they're certainly taking a bite out of consumers' budget because the price of gasoline is going way up very quickly so that people don't have time to adjust to those new higher costs.
A lot of our viewers can relate to that, sir. Now, what do we know so far about what these gas taxes are used for on the provincial and federal level?
Well, they're used as a part of an intake in terms of meeting the expenses that governments have. And they're a consumer tax. And like the GST, provincial and the federal governments love those kind of taxes because they keep going up as people spend more money.
So how reliant are provincial and federal governments in terms of needing the revenue from these gas taxes?
I think they're very reliant on them, and particularly when people say reduce taxes so that we can afford to fill up our tanks with our cars. Governments do have expenses, and they need the additional income in order to meet those higher costs of operating the government. So it's a catch-22.
Definitely. Now, meanwhile, there are calls to scrap or suspend provincial gas taxes, just like in Alberta. But how realistic of a move is this for other provinces?
It's very realistic for Alberta because they're on the intake of higher prices of gasoline because they're the leading province for producing gasoline in Canada. Other provinces, particularly those in the Atlantic region, are going to be hard pressed to reduce or even remove those taxes because they're becoming even more dependent on them as gasoline prices increase.
All right, Professor, well, taking that into consideration, what are some realistic steps that officials can take to potentially ease the burden of these rising prices for Canadian consumers?
I think because of the tremendous impact that this is going to have on the whole population, governments have a moral responsibility to look at the marginalized and people with low incomes and provide them some direct assistance. I would prefer that this be done on a direct individual basis rather than an umbrella basis where all consumers are impacted. The vulnerable and the marginalized communities are in need of more support than people who can adjust their budgets and make through those challenging weeks and perhaps even months ahead.
All right, Professor. Well, in terms of the wider impact of these gas taxes, are we likely to see further inflation in the cost of other products and services that we buy?
Absolutely. This is an excellent question because the increase in gasoline prices impacts almost every product and service that we buy. So the ripple effect from this increase in gasoline prices is going to be felt in almost everything that we buy, from food to produce to vegetables to transportation to services to government services, and everything will be impacted by that cost.
I'm sure our Canadian consumers are not going to be happy about that, sir. Well, we are out of time for this interview, but thank you so much for giving us your time today on Forum Daily, Professor. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. For more news, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on social media for updates. We'll see you again next time.